You wake to the sound of bells slicing through the darkness. The air in the dormitory is so cold that every breath leaves a cloud in front of your face. Your hands, small and trembling, fumble as you pull the rough wool habit over your head. You are only 7 years old. Your bare feet press against the stone floor, long past the point of feeling the cold. Around you, 20 other girls move in silence, their faces pale as wax in the dim light filtering through narrow windows. One little girl, no more than 5, struggles to put on her robes. You ache to help her, but you remember what happened to Margaret when she whispered comfort to another child last week. 3 days without food, 3 days forced to kneel on dried peas scattered across the chapel floor until her knees bled through her stockings. This is not a school. This is not a refuge. This is Whitby Abbey in Yorkshire, England, in the year 1247 AD. And you're here not by choice, but because your father needed the church's favor. For him, you were a bargaining tool. Your childhood ended the moment those heavy oak doors shut behind you 6 months ago. You will never see your mother again. You will never run in open fields or laugh freely. You will never taste honey cakes or sit by a warm hearth surrounded by family. Instead, the years ahead will teach you that survival demands obedience, that hunger is treated as holiness, and that silence is your only companion. Before we dive deeper into these forgotten lives of endurance and loss, if you find these hidden truths of history meaningful, please consider liking and subscribing for more, and share in the comments where you're listening from. I'm always amazed that we're uncovering these ancient stories together from all corners of the world, united by our curiosity about the past. The first bell of the day rings at 4 in the morning. Dawn doesn't bring warmth or hope here, only duty. Even the youngest, children of just 5 years old, stumble from their straw pallets, stiff from sleeping on floors that never lose their chill. Their breath freezes in the air while rats scurry between the stones. At Shaftesbury Abbey in Dorset, founded in 88 AD, the dormitory housed daughters from noble families, abandoned there like unwanted belongings. Lady Giva of Mercia sent her youngest Edith to the abbey in 1043 AD when the girl was barely 4 years old. For powerful families, alliances mattered more than children, and daughters were currency in the politics of the Middle Ages. Edith's story remains in pieces, preserved in the abbey's chronicles, written by Abbess Elfgu in careful Latin. Parvula Edith, she recorded, weeps without cease for 3 days and nights. Her tears freeze upon her cheeks in the morning cold. She calls for her mother in the Saxon tongue, but we speak only Latin here. She must learn her mother is dead to her now, and that God is her only father. Picture these children in their first weeks, hair once lovingly braided, now hacked short to strip away vanity, soft silk gowns replaced by rough wool habits that scrape tender skin, delicate hands once shielded by fine gloves, now cracked and bleeding from constant labor in the bitter cold. Lady Matilda Fitzwalter, sent to Godstow Abbey near Oxford in 1185 AD at the age of 6, later wrote in a secret letter to her sister, I remember the taste of marchpane and the feel of ermine against my cheek. Now I know only the taste of barley gruel and the feel of coarse hemp against my skin. Sometimes I wonder if those early memories were dreams, for this stone world feels too real to have been preceded by any other life. In these places, silence was not a virtue. it was a shield. From the first prayer at dawn until the final bell at night, speaking was forbidden, except for lessons or confession. The girls developed ways to communicate in secret. A glance across the chapel, a hand shifted slightly during prayer, a tilt of the head in the refectory. Hunger, sickness, despair, all could be conveyed with tiny, hidden gestures. At Barking Abbey in Essex, known for its brutal discipline, silence was often shattered by the crack of leather against flesh. The punishment chamber was a bare stone room where girls were dragged for offenses as small as smiling during prayers or moving too slowly in procession. Sister Menard, who served as disciplinarian from 1203 to 1219 AD, kept precise records of punishments in her Liber correction. Reading her notes feels like opening a catalog of cruelty. Alicia, age 7, struck 5 times with the rod for laughing during none. Marguerite, age 9, 15 strokes for speaking during the reading of Scripture. Beatus, age 5, held down by the arms and beaten 10 times for wetting her bed. These were not rare punishments. They happened daily. The children lived in constant fear of committing mistakes they didn't even realize were mistakes. Eleanor of Aquitaine's youngest daughter, Joanna, was placed in Fontevraud Abbey in France in 1176 AD when she was just 11 years old. Letters she wrote to her mother, later discovered in the Abbey's archives in the 19th century, reveal a child slowly crumbling under relentless surveillance and punishment. "Dearest mother," she wrote, "I have learned to move like a shadow and breathe like a whisper. Yesterday, I was beaten for letting my thoughts wander during matins. How do they know what I think? I fear they can see inside my mind. I fear they can see my dreams of home." Food was not simply nourishment, it was control. Children usually ate once a day, twice if fortune allowed. Their meals were gruel, black bread, and water. Meat was forbidden, except on the highest feast days, and even then given in tiny portions. At Wilton Abbey, in Wiltshire, breakfast was a crust of bread with water. Dinner was barley porridge, with a few vegetables from the garden. Girls who arrived plump and rosy from noble homes quickly wasted away. Their cheeks hollowed. Their eyes grew too large for their thin faces. Hunger was deliberate. It was believed to discipline the flesh and bend the will to God. What abbesses ignored was that starving children could not focus on prayer or study. They became consumed by hunger, hoarding crumbs in their clothing, dreaming of food instead of salvation. Agnes of Bohemia, daughter of King Ottokar the Fair, was sent to the Poor Clares Convent in Prague in 1234 AD at age 8. Her confessor, Brother Francis, wrote to her father, "Your daughter speaks of nothing but food. She counts the hours between meals. She weeps not for your absence, but for the memory of roasted fowl and honeyed wine. This is not devotion, your majesty. This is desperation. Winters inside these stone fortresses were brutal. Heating was scarce. Small fires in the chapter house, or the scriptorium at best. Dormitories stayed unheated, even as snow piled against windows and ice formed in the wash basins. At Nunaminster Abbey in Winchester, built in 902 AD, children shared beds 3 or 4 to a thin straw mattress. They slept fully dressed in every garment they owned, yet still woke with frost-bitten fingers and toes. Lady Isabel de Clare, sent to Amesbury Abbey in Wiltshire in 1248 AD at age 6, recalled in her memoir, "I remember the sound of teeth chattering in the dark, like castanets played by invisible hands. I remember the girl beside me Marie, only 5 years old, and newly arrived from Normandy. She spoke no English and cried every night for her nurse. One morning in February, she did not wake. Her lips were blue as violets. They carried her away while we recited prayers, and we never spoke of her again. It was as if she had never existed. Death was constant and rarely remarked upon. Children died from cold, from illness, from malnutrition, from despair. Abbey records show mortality rates nearing 30% for girls under 10. Their deaths were written down without grief or ceremony. At Shaftesbury Abbey, the death roll for 1209 AD lists Johanna, age 5, fever, on the feast of St. Michael, Marguerite, age 7, wasting sickness on the feast of St. Luke, Beatrice, age 6, consumption on the feast of St. Martin. No surnames, no notice to families, no marked graves, just entries in account books, their short lives reduced to a line of ink. Education, when given, was minimal. Most girls learned enough Latin to follow prayer books and memorize psalms. Writing was taught only to a few, usually those chosen for administrative work. Arithmetic was nearly absent. History was restricted to Bible stories and saints' lives. Science was discouraged as dangerous. It might lead to questioning God's mysteries. At Lecoq Abbey in Wiltshire, founded in 1229 AD, the curriculum included memorizing psalms, embroidering vestments, and studying female saints. Lady Ela of Salisbury, who founded the abbey, wrote in its charter, "Their own tastes, personalities, and dreams, but were molded into empty vessels for religious devotion, stripped of spirit under the weight of absolute obedience. Let the young maids learn submission through Scripture, patience through needlework, and humility through the study of those holy women who suffered for Christ." There was no mention of mathematics, no training in healing, no literature beyond Scripture. The goal was not to teach them to think, but to make them obey. Physical punishment was central to this education. The rod, the strap, fasting, all were seen as tools of salvation. Creativity or independence was crushed. At Dartford Priory in Kent, founded in 1355 AD, the rule was blunt. Spare not the rod, for it is through suffering that the young soul learns to love God above all earthly things. Abbess Dame Joan Vaux became notorious across England for her severity. She kept a bundle of willow switches, each labeled with the name of a girl. Parents visiting their daughters saw welts on arms and backs, but remained silent. To question the abbess was to question God himself. Sister Marguerite of Hainaut, novice mistress at Poissy Abbey in France from 1298 to 1315 AD, revealed in her private journal, "Today I struck young Blanche 20 times for asking why God allows suffering. She is 8 years old, and asked why her baby brother died if God loves children. Such questions are dangerous. They lead to doubt, and doubt is the enemy of faith. Better she learns through pain than through reason, for reason leads to perdition." Even sleep was rationed. Children were jolted awake for prayers at midnight for matins, again at 3 a.m. for lauds, and at dawn for prime. Already weakened by hunger and cold, their growing bodies suffered under constant exhaustion. At Godstow Abbey, where Rosamond Clifford, Henry II's mistress, was buried in 1176 AD, the night bells rang so often that the children developed a kind of waking sleep. They would rise and chant prayers, half conscious, eyes open, but unseeing, their voices reciting words memorized by habit rather than faith. Lady Alice Fitzhugh, who spent 12 years at Godstow, beginning in 1289 AD, later wrote to her niece, "I learned to pray in my sleep, to sing psalms while dreaming, to let my mind wander to sunlight and laughter. We were like clockwork dolls, wound up each morning and set in motion by the bells. I feared that if the bells ever ceased, I would collapse, for I no longer knew how to move without their command." Emotional bonds were not simply discouraged, they were forbidden. Children were told that love for family was idolatry, that friendship was sinful, and that any earthly affection blocked the path to salvation. At St. Osyth's Abbey in Bedfordshire, the very place where John Bunyan would later draw inspiration for Pilgrim's Progress, girls were not allowed to form close friendships. They were moved from one dormitory to another to prevent attachments. Letters from home were read aloud before the entire community, stripping them of privacy. Gifts sent by parents were seized and divided equally among all, erasing any sense of personal care. At Barking Abbey, Dame Clemens, abbess from 1173 to 1186 AD, enforced what she called spiritual detachment. She declared, "The past is death. Only the present service to God matters. Those who dwell on earthly affections will find no peace in prayer." Children who dared to speak of their parents or siblings were punished with solitary confinement, locked in stone cells, and fed only bread and water until they promised to renounce their worldly ties. Young Lady Maud de Brassey, sent to a convent priory in Herefordshire in 1235 AD at age 7, kept a secret diary. In it she wrote, "I try to remember my mother's face, but it grows dimmer each day. Sister Agatha says this is good, that I am learning to love God more than earthly things, but I do not feel love for God. I feel only emptiness, as if something precious has been carved from my chest with a dull knife. I pretend to be holy, but inside I am becoming hollow." Physical abuse extended beyond formal punishments. Children were slapped for showing emotion, pinched for inattention, struck for the smallest mistake. At Romsey Abbey in Hampshire, where the future St. Christina of Margate once sought refuge in 1114 AD, daily life included what was politely called correction. In practice, this meant constant intimidation. Girls learned to flinch at sudden movements, keep their eyes lowered, and speak only when spoken to. In the scriptorium at Shaftesbury Abbey, one manuscript, illuminated by a girl named Adelheid in 1267 AD, revealed something extraordinary. In the margins, hidden among the decorations, she had drawn tiny figures, children with tears streaming down their faces. These marginalia went unnoticed until 1923, when restorers discovered them. Art historians believe they were secret cries for help, the only way a child could express fear. Crude stick figures with wide, haunted eyes, hands pressed to their mouths, bodies bent in silent suffering. Though rarely acknowledged, evidence of sexual abuse emerges in confession records and private letters. At Atwell Abbey in Hampshire, founded in 986 AD, Father Edmund the Confessor wrote to his bishop in 1278 AD, "I am troubled by what I hear in confession. Young girls speak of unseemly touching by elder sisters, of being forced to lie with them for warmth in ways that disturb their innocence. They fear punishment if they resist. I know not how to counsel them, yet surely their souls are being harmed." At Stow Abbey where Dame Agnes of Huntingdon ruled as abbess from 1257 to 1281 AD. Accusations arose from several noble families. Letters exchanged between Bishop Hugh of Lincoln and the Archbishop of Canterbury describe unseemly conduct with the younger maids and practices that corrupt the innocent, but the inquiry vanished. Once Dame Agnes provided large sums to the church, and the complainants were silenced under threat of excommunication. Lady Isabel de Force, daughter of the Earl of Devon, was removed from Canonsley Abbey in Devon in 1284 AD after she smuggled a coded plea to her father. William de Force wrote to King Edward VI, "My daughter speaks of things that cannot be named, of sisters who come to her bed in the night and do unholy acts." When I demanded answers, the abbess claimed my child was mad with religious fervor, but I have seen the marks on her body, the terror in her eyes. I will not leave her in that place of corruption. Medical care was primitive and often more harmful than helpful. Sick children were bled, purged, or left to prayer. At Wilton Abbey, the infirmary was a bare stone chamber with little heat and no windows. The sick were isolated, left to recover or die alone. In 1245 AD, the chronicler Sister Mathilde recorded, "Little Constance suffers with a fever that burns her flesh and makes her speak in strange tongues. We have bled her thrice and given bitter herbs, but she weakens still. The abbess says it is God's will, that perhaps her suffering will purchase grace for us all." Herbal remedies existed, but they were often bound up with ritual and superstition. At Amesbury Abbey, Sister Beatus, the herbalist, wrote detailed recipes for fever. Mix wormwood with holy water and blessed salt. If the child still burns, apply leeches to the temples while reciting 50 Ave Marias. Should the fever break, give thanks to St. Dunstan. Should the child die, give thanks to God for calling another innocent soul to heaven. The psychological wounds left by such a childhood were deep. Survivors often carried what today we would call trauma, nightmares, anxiety, depression, difficulties forming bonds. Lady Margaret Boet, who spent 3 years at Maxstoke Priory in Warwickshire between 1439 and 1442 AD, confessed in her private devotional, "I am 30 years old, yet I still wake in terror when church bells ring. I still count the hours between meals. I still move quietly through my own home, afraid that any noise will bring punishment. The child I was died in that place, but her ghost haunts every moment of my life." Some children tried to escape, though very few ever succeeded. At Godstow Abbey, a young girl named Mabel of Gloucester tried to escape in 1278 AD by hiding inside a supply cart bound for Oxford. She was quickly discovered, dragged back, and locked in the Abbey's underground punishment cell for 3 months. The chamber was so small that a child could hardly stretch out, with no light and barely any food. When she was finally released, other children noticed that she could no longer speak clearly. She would sit rocking back and forth, humming without any tune. Dallas of Normandy, who served as abbess of Malling Abbey in Kent between 1289 and 1315 AD, kept careful notes of such escape attempts. In her journal she wrote, "Young Marie tried to climb the walls during matins but fell and broke her arm," which Dallas claimed was God's punishment for her disobedience. Catherine attempted to hide inside a hay wagon headed for Canterbury, but was caught and taken back for correction. Isabel pretended to be sick in order to be taken to the infirmary, planning to slip away from there. but her plan failed. To Dallas, each of these attempts showed the same sinful refusal to accept God's plan for their lives. The saddest part of these records is how children were broken down piece by piece. They entered as living individuals. With that barking Abby, the chronicler Sister Euphemia wrote with what sounds like pride. She described the arrival of young Lady Philippa the previous spring, a proud girl who often talked of her silk gowns and her pet falcon. Months later, Euphemia wrote with satisfaction that Philippa had knelt before her, begging forgiveness for her vanity. The girl asked for her hair to be cut shorter, her meals reduced even more, and extra penances to be imposed. Euphemia concluded, God has conquered her rebellious heart. This was not an education. It was a calculated destruction of identity. Children were trained to believe that their thoughts were dangerous, their emotions sinful, and their bodies shameful. They were taught to distrust their own feelings, to fear their own minds, and to submit completely without question. At Romsey Abbey, the novice mistress, Dame Scholastica, set out instructions for shaping young girls. They must be taught that their will was corrupt, their desires evil, and that their only salvation was in total surrender to God's representatives on earth. They must learn to despise what once brought joy, to fear what once gave comfort, and to find peace only in absolute obedience. The tragic irony was that many of these girls came from powerful, wealthy families who could have offered them education, security, and meaningful lives. Instead, they were handed over to serve political goals, religious extremism, and the belief that suffering purified the soul. Lady Eleanor de Montfort, daughter of Simon de Montfort, was sent to Amesbury Abbey in 1265 AD at the age of 8 after her father's death in battle. In a letter to her mother, she wrote, I had everything a child could want: books, music, fine clothes, caring servants. Now I have nothing but cold stones and endless prayers. They tell me I am blessed, closer to God than those in the world. But I feel farther from heaven than ever, for how can a God of love cause such misery for his smallest children? Some children resisted quietly, keeping their humanity alive through small acts. At Shaftesbury Abbey, archaeologists in the 1960s found hidden objects tucked into the dormitory wall: a wooden doll, a piece of colored glass, a pressed flower, and a letter in a child's hand. These were treasures hidden by children who refused to be erased. The letter, written in Norman French, read, My name is Aliénor. I am 7 years old. I have been here for 2 years. I remember my mother's voice when she sang to me. I remember my father's beard against my cheek. I remember my dog, Rousseau, who slept at the foot of my bed. I write this so that someone will know I was here, that I was real, that I was loved. The long-term damage was severe. Many children died young from illness, hunger, or despair. Survivors often carried lifelong wounds: mental illness, fear of relationships, and a deep terror of authority. Some became abbesses themselves and repeated the same cruelties. Others, once freed, found they could not adapt to normal life. Lady Matilda of Gloucester spent 8 years at Wilton Abbey, starting in 1245 AD. When her family finally brought her home at 16, her brother Earl Gilbert wrote to their mother, Matilda is so altered, I scarcely know her. She speaks only in whispers, jumps at sudden sounds, and will not eat unless ordered. When I embraced her, she recoiled as if I meant her harm. Whatever they did in that place, they have killed the sister I knew and left only a frightened ghost. The economic side cannot be ignored. Noble families paid heavy dowries to place daughters in convents, often more than marriage costs. This made abbeys rich, building land, wealth, and political power. At Shaftesbury Abbey, records show that in 1267 AD, they received over 2,000 marks in dowries from noble families, equal to millions of dollars today. Dame Juliana of Norwich, abbess of Carrow Abbey between 1342 and 1359 AD, wrote plainly about the financial motives. The noble families paid dearly to rid themselves of excess daughters. We give them a holy excuse for what is really abandonment. The children suffer, but the coffers are filled, and the church gains strength. At times, I wonder whether God approves of trading innocence for gold. Worst of all, once given away, the children were forgotten. Families treated them as if dead. Inheritance laws ignored them. Marriages and alliances went forward without mention of them. Family histories erased their names. Lady Agnes de Vesky, placed in Arden Priory in Yorkshire in 1308 AD at age 5, wrote 2 decades later, "I have heard nothing from my family since the day I entered. I do not know if my parents live or are gone. I do not know if my brothers married or had children. I am a ghost to them, and they are ghosts to me. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined my family, if they were just a dream. The methods used to break children were deliberate and cruel. They were cut off from anything familiar, kept under constant watch, punished for tears, and rewarded only for surrender. At Nunton Priory in Yorkshire, the rule declared the young maid must always be watched, alone. She may remember her past life and grow sorrowful. If she weeps, she must be corrected. If she smiles, she must be questioned. If she speaks of home, she must be punished. Only when she shows no joy, no sorrow, but perfect indifference to all earthly things has she reached grace. Today's psychologists would instantly recognize this as systematic, psychological abuse meant to create helplessness and total dependence. The children were forced to believe they were powerless, that resistance was useless, and that their only safety lay in absolute submission. At Barking Abbey, novice mistress Dame Eugenia wrote, "A properly trained child should move like a shadow, speak like an echo, and think like a prayer book. She should have no will of her own, no opinions of her own, no dreams of her own. She must be an empty vessel, ready to be filled with God's will, as given by her superiors." And yet, some children fought quietly to hold on to themselves. Lady Margaret de Clare, who spent 6 years at Amesbury Abbey from 1282 AD, secretly kept a coded diary. In it, she wrote, "They have taken my name and call me Sister Scholastica. They have taken my hair and covered me with coarse cloth. They have taken my voice and demand silence, but they cannot take my thoughts, though they try. In my mind, I am still Margaret. I still love silk and honey, and I still remember my mother's laughter and my father's stories. They may own my body, but my soul is mine. The hardest truth is the role of families. Parents who claimed to love their daughters knowingly sent them to lives of misery. Surviving letters show chilling indifference. Lord Hugh de Mortimer wrote to the abbess of a Conbury priory in 1278 AD, "I send my daughter Isabel to your care. She is willful and laughs too often. Faults, I trust, you will correct with proper discipline. Do not spare the rod. I would rather have a godly daughter than a happy one." Lady Joan de Geneville wrote to her daughter at Amesbury Abbey in 1290 AD, "I am glad to hear you have learned obedience and no longer weep for your old life. Your suffering now will purchase ease in the world to come. Remember that earthly happiness is fleeting, but heavenly reward is eternal. Bear your trials with patience, and know that I am proud of your sacrifice." Letters like these show how parents convinced themselves that sending their children into hardship was an act of love. They believed suffering built character, that pain was holy, and that breaking a child's will was for their own good. The way they justified their actions mirrors what abusers throughout history have said, that pain is necessary, that it serves a higher purpose, and that it is somehow beneficial. The medical effects of these conditions were severe and well documented. At Wilton Abbey, death records reveal that nearly half of the children admitted died before adulthood. Causes were predictable: malnutrition, disease, exposure, and what chroniclers called failure to thrive. Today, we would understand this phrase as deaths caused by systematic neglect and psychological trauma. Sister Margaret, the infirmarian at Shaftesbury Abbey, wrote in 1289 AD, "Young Beatrice grows thinner each day, despite our efforts to feed her. She cannot keep food down and speaks constantly of her mother. I fear her body fails because her spirit is broken." The abbess replied, "This is God's will, yet I have seen many children sicken and die the same way. Their bodies give up once their hearts are destroyed." Though medieval people did not understand trauma, they clearly observed how despair consumed children. Those who could not adapt to harsh conditions wasted away, losing weight, becoming weak and listless, and dying without obvious physical illness. Modern medicine would recognize this as the body collapsing under psychological stress. Education in these convents was minimal and entirely religious. At Lecoq Abbey, the curriculum was limited to memorizing Latin prayers, reading basic devotional texts, and learning embroidery or manuscript copying. Subjects like mathematics, history, science, or literature were absent. The goal was not learning, but indoctrination. Dame Ela of Salisbury, the foundress of Lecoq Abbey, wrote in 1232 AD, "Let the young maids learn only what is necessary for the service of God. Too much learning breeds pride, and pride is the root of sin. Better they remain ignorant of worldly knowledge and pure in their devotion than clever in speech and corrupt in heart." Restricting education served many purposes. It kept the girls dependent on their teachers, prevented them from questioning authority, and left them helpless if they were ever released. Children raised in convents from a young age often found themselves completely unprepared for ordinary life. The physical conditions were equally harsh: cold stone floors, unheated dormitories, and bare furnishings were seen as character building. At Godstow Abbey, a bishop who visited in 1278 AD described the dormitory as colder than a tomb and darker than a dungeon. The girls slept on straw pallets, laid directly on the floor, with thin wool blankets that offered little warmth. Small, narrow windows kept the rooms in perpetual gloom. Water for washing was scarce, and often frozen in winter. Girls were expected to remain clean despite these conditions, and failure to do so brought punishment. At Romsey Abbey, the rule stated, Cleanliness is next to godliness, but comfort is the enemy of devotion. The young maids shall wash in cold water and find joy in their discomfort, for it reminds them of their mortal nature and their need for divine grace. The effect of constant discomfort was crushing. Children who were cold, hungry, and physically miserable could not focus on prayers or learning. A physician visiting Barking Abbey in 1285 AD observed, "The children here are so consumed with their bodily misery that they cannot attend to their prayers. They shiver through Mass, fidget in lessons, and dream of a warmth instead of salvation." Another method of control was social isolation. Friendships were forbidden, affection discouraged, and loyalty to anyone other than religious superiors punished. At Elton Abbey, the rule declared, "Particular friendships are the devil's snare. The young maids shall love all equally, and none specially. They shall not exchange gifts, share secrets, or show preference for any companion. Their hearts must be reserved for God alone." The result was deep loneliness. Surrounded by other children, they were still utterly alone. Lady Alice Deasy, who spent 5 years at Nunton Priory, beginning in 1301 AD, wrote, "I am surrounded by others, yet I am more alone than if I were the only soul on earth. We may not comfort one another, share sorrows, or offer friendship. We are like islands in a silent sea, each drowning in our own despair." The long-term psychological toll was immense. Survivors often displayed what modern psychology would identify as complex post-traumatic stress disorder: distrust, inability to form relationships, and difficulty functioning in society. Many repeated the cycle of abuse, convinced that cruelty was the only way to raise children. Dame Margaret of Anjou, who became Abbess of Amesbury in 1315 AD after growing up there, wrote to another abbess, "I know no other way to train children than as I was trained. The rod and the harsh word were my teachers, and they shall be the teachers of the children in my care. At times, I wonder if gentler ways exist, but I fear that kindness breeds weakness, and weakness breeds sin." The cycle of abuse was clear. Those who were brutalized as girls often became the enforcers of the same system. At Shaftesbury Abbey, the same cruel methods of control were used for centuries, passed down from one generation of abbesses to the next, like an inherited curse. The children were also exploited for labor. Their work was vital to the convents, and they spent long hours performing tasks beyond their age and strength. At Wilton Abbey, girls as young as 6 were sent to the scriptorium, where they copied manuscripts in dim light, damaging their eyesight and stunting their growth. Account books show that manuscripts produced by child labor brought in significant income. Lady Constance of Brittany, who spent 7 years at Wilton Abbey, beginning in 1287 AD, wrote, "My hands are stained with ink from endless copying. My back is bent from hours at the desk. My eyes ache from straining in the dark. We are not pupils here. We are laborers disguised as novices. Children in the kitchens fared no better. At Barking Abbey, girls as young as 5 helped prepare meals, working with boiling water and sharp knives under little supervision. Injuries were common, and pain was treated as a lesson. The Abbey's chronicler recorded, "Young Matilda burned her arm severely while stirring the porridge. She bore the pain without crying, which shows proper spiritual development. Pain teaches patience, and patience leads to devotion. The greatest tragedy fell on children who refused to fully submit, those who held on to a piece of themselves. Their resistance was seen as rebellion, bringing harsher punishments. At Godstow Abbey, a girl named Johanna of Winchester endured 3 years of repeated punishments simply because she would not stop asking about her family. She was eventually locked in a cell, so cramped she could not even stand upright. Her meals were reduced to nothing more than bread and water, and she was denied all human contact except for the daily interrogations, where she was pressed again and again to submit. The Abbey's disciplinary records preserve her words. They show a brave child slowly being broken by relentless cruelty. I asked again if God truly wants children to suffer. She told her questioners. I asked why prayer feels like poison in my mouth. I asked why I still dream of my mother's face, if I am supposed to forget her. These questions come from my heart, not from the devil. Why is my heart so evil? After 6 months of complete isolation, Johanna's questions ceased. She stepped out of her cell, silent and subdued, her eyes drained of the spark that once lit them. The Abbey chronicler wrote with satisfaction, Johanna has finally reached the proper state of submission. She no longer asks disturbing questions or speaks of her former life. God has conquered her rebellious spirit. But this was not salvation. It was destruction. These children were never being prepared for heaven. They were being conditioned for hell on earth, trained to accept suffering as normal, to mistake abuse for love, and to see silence as virtue. The very qualities that made them human, curiosity, warmth, hope, were deliberately crushed under the guise of holiness. When the monasteries were dissolved under Henry VIII in the 1530s, many of these children were suddenly freed. But for most, that freedom came too late. Women who had spent their whole lives behind convent walls found themselves helpless in the outside world. They had no practical knowledge, no way of understanding ordinary life, no ability to build normal relationships. Some became beggars, others withdrew into lonely hermitages. A few lost their sanity altogether, unable to cope with sudden liberty. Lady Margaret Pole, who as a child had been imprisoned at Sion Abbey, wrote after the dissolution, "They have opened the cage, but the bird has forgotten how to fly. I stand in sunlight and feel only fear. I hear laughter and do not understand its meaning. I am free, but I am not alive." They killed the child. I was so thoroughly that no woman could ever grow from her remains. The stories of these children remind us that institutional abuse is not a modern crime. The deliberate destruction of childhood, carried out in the name of a higher purpose, has deep and ancient roots. The same justifications once used by medieval abbesses echo across the centuries, repeated by every authority that has ever claimed that cruelty serves a noble cause. Tonight, as you rest in a warm bed, remember the children who lay on cold stone floors, who cried into straw pillows, who longed for their mothers' faces, though they were forbidden to remember them. They were not distant figures from some savage age. They were children, just like any children, needing love, safety, and kindness. Their voices were silenced, their names erased, their suffering dismissed as holy sacrifice. But their stories still live in the margins of manuscripts, in the cracks of ruined stones, in the confessions of dying nuns. They remind us of a truth that cannot be forgotten. When power goes unquestioned, it is always the vulnerable who pay the price, and no cause, no matter how sacred it claims to be, can ever justify the destruction of a child's soul. The bells that once forced them to prayer are silent now. The stone walls that confined them have fallen. The abbesses who tormented them have long turned to dust, yet the echo of their pain remains, a warning from history that childhood is sacred, innocence must be protected, and any system that destroys the young in the name of salvation is itself damned. You wake to the sound of bells ringing through the night, but this time you do not wake in a cold dormitory filled with frightened children. You wake in a world where childhood is cherished, where children's voices matter, where suffering is no longer mistaken for holiness. The bells that ring today are not calls to forced prayer, but calls to remembrance, remembrance of those who had no choice, no voice, no escape from the stone fortresses that promised heaven, yet delivered only hell. Remember them, remember their names when they survive in records, remember their pain when it is preserved in testimony, remember their courage when it shone briefly before being extinguished. Remember always that they were children first, victims second, and never mere statistics. By remembering, we honor not just their suffering, but their humanity, and in honoring their humanity, we protect ourselves from ever allowing such systems to rise again. Systems that would sacrifice the innocent in the name of causes that were never truly sacred. The bells ring on, not for domination, but for memory.